In this episode, we are going to protect our API endpoints with JWT. This is Sakura Dev Channel, and welcome back to the episode 15 of our NestJS full course. Alright, I open up our NestJS project, and in the first step, we need to install the dependencies. So I open up the terminal, and here, let's install at nestjs/JWT and also passport JWT. Alright, now let's install the types of the passport JWT. So I'm going to say npm i-d because it's a dev dependency, and then add types/passport-JWT. Alright, now let's go to the auth controller, and here we have set up the local strategy for using password authentication for the login API. So this is the scenario. For the first time, the user needs to provide a username password to the login API, and here upon the successful login of the user, we need to create a JWT token and return it back to the client along with its user ID. And then the client, on its next request to our APIs, must include this access token inside its request header. Then in the protected API in our NestJS project, we're going to check the header of the request and then extract the JWT token, validate the JWT, and if the JWT is valid, we're going to allow the user to access that protected API. This is called JWT protection of our API endpoints. So in the first step here, after a successful login with the local strategy, we need to create a JWT token based on the ID of the user and send it back to the client. And we are going to create that JWT token with the JWT module of the NestJS. So now first, let's configure the JWT module in the Auth module. So inside the import section of the Auth module, we need to configure the JWT module. So here, inside the imports list, we're going to add JWT module that comes from the NestJS/JWT package that we have just installed. And then we're going to call the register function. And inside this register function, we need to set some configuration. The first and most important one is the secret key. So what is this secret key? Well, this secret key is used to create a JWT token. And later, when we are going to validate the JWT token, we need that secret key. So think of it as a key to a lock. You lock the door with your key and keep it in a safe place, and then later when you are going to open that door, you need to provide the same key. That's the idea behind this secret key for creating the JWT. So as you might notice here, this secret key is a sensitive data and we shouldn't keep it inside our code base. Actually, the better idea is to keep it inside our env files. So in the next step, we're going to create a config module and put this secret key inside our env file and then load it from that env file with the config module. So now let's put an empty string here. And the other option that we need to provide is the expired in. So here inside the sign option, we have an option called expired in, which define the expiration time of the JWT. We can set it to, for example, 1 day, and our JWT is only valid for 1 day. We can set it to 48 hours, for example, or even 7 day, or whatever value that we want. But after the expiry time, our JWT token is no longer valid. So here in our application, we're going to set it to just 1 day, and after 1 day from the creation time of the JWT token, the token is not valid anymore. Actually, after the expiry time, the user must log in again with its username password into our application, or we can provide a refresh token functionality with which the user can refresh its expired token. So this is the topic of our next episode. You can subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell in order to get informed about the next video. So now let's move on, and now let's create two env variables inside our env file. The first one for the secret key of the JWT module, and the second one for the expiry time. So let's go to the env file, and then here let's create two variables. The first one is going to be JWT secret, and we're going to create a secret key in a second, and the second one is going to be JWT expire in. we're going to set it to 1 day. And for the JWT secret, let's create a strong secret key with OpenSSL. So I open up the terminal. Let's close this off first and use OpenSSL command, rand-hex, and then 32, which is the number of bytes for generating the secret key. You can set it, for example, to 16, but 32 creates a longer secret key. So let's create our secret key here. And as you can see, this is a really strong secret key. So let's copy that and paste it in front of the JWT secret variable. All right, now let's go to the Auth module, and here let's create a config directory, config, and inside it we're going to create a jwt.config.ts. Here let's export a factory function. And before doing that, if you haven't watched the config episode of this course, I recommend you to watch that episode so you can better understand the config section of this video. So let's get back to our config file, and we need to export a factory function. So export default anonymous function, and it is going to return an object that contains secret and expire in. So let's set its return type to JWT Module option. Now we can return our JWT Module option object from this factory function. It is going to have a secret, and we're going to read that from process.env.jwt secret, and also we're going to have a sign-in option. So the autocomplete is because of this type that we have set to the returning type of this factory function. So inside the sign-in option, we're going to set the expires in, and again read that value from our env file. Okay, now we can also use the register as function from NestJS config to create a namespace for this config object. So here we're going to call the register as, that comes from the NestJS/common, and in the first parameter we need to create the namespace. We're going to set the JWT, and in the next parameter we need to pass the factory function, and we just need to put the closing parentheses of the register as function here. Let's save this, and now we can use this config file for configuring our JWT module. So let's get back to the Auth module, and here instead of register function we are going to call the register async, and instead of just passing the option object directly to it, we're going to use our JWT config file that we have just created inside the config directory, and actually it's a factory option we can call the as provider here, which actually finally return the config object for this register async function. So let's put a comma here, and as you can see the error is gone. So in this way we put our sensitive values, the secret key and also the expires in values in the env file, then create a config file for it, use the register as function from the NestJS/config to create namespace for it. Actually this is not necessary, but we can later use the config service with that name, and we just need to export a factory function which returns the final config object, and here in the config object we read the value of the JWT secret and JWT expire in from our env file. And then inside the Auth module, we just pass the jwt.config as provider to the register async function of the JWT module. It will actually use this configuration file in order to config this JWT module, and now we can use it in order to create a JWT token. Okay, now let's get to the Auth controller. In the login API, now we need to create a JWT token with our JWT module with the user ID. So for creating the JWT, let's create a function inside the Auth service, and let's call it login. It takes the user ID, which is going to be a number, and it should create a JWT token with the provided user ID and then return it back to the Auth controller. So in order to create the JWT, we need to use the JWT service. Therefore, we need to inject it in the constructor for this class. So I'm going to say private JWT service and set its type to JWT service class. As you can see, it comes from the NestJS/JWT. Now we can use this JWT service inside our login function. So we just return this .jwt service and then call the sign function. So here we need to pass an object that actually is called payload. So what is the payload object? Actually, it's just a object, and inside it, we are going to pass our information that we need to be encrypted inside the JWT under the property name SOP. So first, let's create a type for our JWT payload and then create that function from that type and pass it to the sign function. So let's create a types directory in our auth module, and then inside it, we're going to create a auth-jwt payload.t.ts. And inside it, we can just export a type. I'm going to call it auth-jwt payload, and it is going to be an object. Inside it, we need to have a SOP, and actually in this SOP property, we need to pass all the data that we need to be encrypted in our JWT. So in this case, we just want to encrypt the user ID inside our JWT. Note that the value that we pass to the SOP property can be retrieved from the JWT token if we have the secret key. So since we are going to just pass the user ID, we're going to set its type to number. Okay, now we can use this type inside our auth service for creating a payload. So first, let's create the payload, const payload, and then set its type to auth JWT payload. Then we can set it to an object. As you can see, now it has a SOP inside it, and set the SOP to user ID that we've got from the parameters of this function. And then we just need to pass the payload to the sign function. So here, as you can see, we don't need to provide the secret key for creating or signing a JWT token. And that's because in the auth module, we config this JWT module with our JWT config file, in which we have set the secret key and expire in options. So we don't need to provide the secret key every time we want to use our JWT service. All right, now this login function takes the user ID and then just create the JWT token and return it back. So now inside the auth controller, here instead of just returning the user, we're going to return a object that actually contains the user ID. So I'm going to say rec.user.id, and also we're going to include the JWT token. So first, let's call the login function of the auth service to create a JWT token. So I'm going to say const token, and then call the auth service.login function and provide the user ID. So we're going to extract the user from the request and then pass its ID to the login function. This function creates the token, and we keep it inside the token constant, and we just send it back to the client along with the user ID. So let's create the property ID, which actually is the ID of the user and also the JWT access token. So the user keeps this token, and every time he wants to access to our protected API, the user should provide this token inside its request header. So let's run the server to test the login API again. Okay, now let's get to Insomnia and let's send a request to our login API /auth/login, and also provide a valid username and password in the body of our request. Now let's send the request. As you can see here, it returns an object that contains the ID of the authenticated user and also a token, which is actually a JWT token for this user. Now the user can use this JWT token in order to access to our protected API. So now in the next step, we need to create the JWT strategy of the passport package in order to protect our APIs with JWT. So if you have watched this video up to this point, probably this video is helpful for you. So please hit the like button in order to support me grow faster on YouTube. Thanks for your support. Now let's get back to our project and let's go to the strategies directory and just create a new file. I'm going to call it jwt.strategy.ts. Okay, in here we need to export a class. I'm going to call it JWT strategy that extends the base JWT strategy of the passport package. So here we need to call the passport strategy function and pass the strategy from passport-JWT. So as you can see, the strategies from the passport local and passport JWT is exported under the same name, just strategy. So here, make sure to import this strategy strategy from the passport-JWT. So this JWT strategy is actually responsible for extracting the JWT from the incoming request headers and check if the JWT is valid, and if that's the case, it allows the user to access that protected API. So here inside the constructor, we need to call the super function, and inside it we need to set some configurations. So the first one is JWT from request. It actually determines where we are going to extract the JWT from the incoming request. So here we're going to use extract JWT that comes from the passport JWT, and then set it to from auth header as bearer token. So now it expects the JWT to be present inside the headers of the request as a bearer token. The next one is the secret key that is using for decoding the JWT. So the secret key must be the same secret key that we have used for signing a JWT. So we need to get it from our config file. So for doing that, we need to inject our config service here, but first we need to get back to our Auth module and register our JWT config with the config module. So here we're going to call config module and then call for feature and then pass the JWT config file that comes from the JWT config file in the configs directory. It's just like the for feature function of the type ORM that register a repository inside modules. So now we can access to the JWT config in the services of this module. So let's get back to the JWT strategy and inject the JWT config into this class. So in the constructor, I'm going to say private JWT config and set its type to config type that comes from the NestJS /config, and then pass the type of our JWT config. So we use the type of keyword and pass the JWT config from our configs directory. And we have an error here, and that's because we use the same name for our JWT config dependency and also the JWT type config type. So we need to rename this. For example, we're going to set it to JWT configuration, and the error is gone. So we can use the JWT configuration here to set the secret or key. So pay attention to the spelling here, and we're going to set it to JWT configuration dot secret option. So now we have successfully configured our JWT strategy. It looks for the JWT token inside the header of the request as a bearer token, and we also provided the secret key for decoding the JWT. Then as the local strategy, we should implement a validate function. So out of the constructor, we're going to have a validate function. It takes the decoded payload from the JWT. It is really important. You might be confused about the validate function. It's not for validating the JWT itself. The extracting and decoding and also validating the JWT token is done by the passport strategy base class. This validate function is just receive that decoded payload from the JWT. So its type is going to be of JWT payload that we have created inside the types directory here. Then here we can return an object. That object, just like the validate function of the local strategy, will be appended to the request object under the name user. There's a subtle difference between the validate function of the JWT and the validate function of the local strategy. Inside the validate function of the local strategy, we got the extracted email and password from the body of the request, and then here we need to actually validate this email and password. So we call the validate user of the auth service. We check the correctness of the email and password of the user. But here in the JWT validate function, we don't need to validate the JWT. The payload has already been validated and then passed to this validate function. So we just need to unpack the payload and just return what is necessary to our protected API. Here we just need to extract the ID of the user from the payload and then just send it to the protected API. So we just return an object that has ID inside it, and we're going to set it to payload.sub. So remember that when we created the JWT token, in the auth service, we just set the SOP to user ID, and now we can extract it from the decoded payload from the SOP property. So again, this object will be appended to the request object under the name user. So now we can protect our APIs with the JWT strategy. But before doing that, let me create a custom guard for our JWT strategy. So I open up the terminal, and here we're going to use NestJS for creating the guard, NestGGU, which stands for guard, and it is going to be inside the Auth module, and then /guards, and then let's call it JWT-auth. So as you can see inside the guards directory, now we have a JWT auth, and let's just extend the auth guard from the passport. So we don't want this, just like the local auth guard, we just need to extend the returning class of the auth guard function that comes from the NestJS/passport and specify the name JWT for it. Okay, now we need to just put the body of the class, and also we need to register the JWT strategy inside our auth module. So first we need to mark it with injectable. Okay, now let's go to the auth module, and here in the providers, let's register the JWT strategy. Okay, now we can protect our APIs with the JWT strategy. Now let's quickly go to the user module, and inside the user controller, let's create a get profile function. So we don't need these two functions, get one and find all. We're going to create a get endpoint under the path profile, and then create a function for it, get profile, and it is going to call the user service dot find one function. So we just return this dot user service dot find one function, and here we need to provide the ID of the user. So you might want to just extract the ID of the user from the params. It's not a good idea. Instead, we are going to protect this API with the JWT guard. So we're going to use guards decorator and then pass the JWT auth guard. All right, so when this API is called by the client, first it goes through the JWT auth guard and it activates the JWT strategy. It looks for the JWT token inside the header of the request and then validate the JWT, and if it's valid, it actually decodes the JWT and sends the decoded payload to the validate function of the JWT strategy, and then it just returns an object that contains the ID of the user. Then it will be appended to the request object under the name user. So here we can access to the request object. We're going to use @request decorator, or we can use just @rec to access the request object, and here we can pass the rec.user.id to the user service.find function. So again, don't extract the ID of the user from the params object. It's not secure because it actually allows other users to get the profile of another user. But here with the JWT guard, in order to get the ID of the user, we're going to extract it from the JWT token of the user. Okay, so let's open up our terminal to see if we have any error. So here we have error with the JWT strategy. Okay, so let's get back to the JWT strategy, and here as you can see we have injected JWT config file into this constructor. So in order to do that, actually we need to use inject decorator and define a key for this dependency. So we're going to use JWT config.key, and if I save this, as you can see, the error is gone and our NestJS application is up and running. So let's get back to Insomnia and send the request to the /user and then /profile. So let's send it, and immediately we've gotten an unauthorized message. And that's because this is a protected API. In order to access this API, we need to provide a JWT access token. So now let's send a post request to the login API to get an access token. So we're going to call the login API /auth/login and send a post request to it. Inside the body, we have already an email and password. So let's send the request. As you can see, we have the token inside the returning object. Let's copy that, and now let's send a get request to the /user and then /profile. Okay, now get to the auth section, and inside the token, let's just paste the access token and now send the request. You can see it returns actually the string that the user service here returns as the response. So let's use the user repository to get the user object from our database. So first, let me turn it to an async function and return this the user repo that find one, pass the where object and just include the ID inside it. And also let's just select the first name, last name, and also avatar URL. Okay, so now let's get back to Insomnia again, send our GET request to the user profile. And now, as you can see, we have the user object in the response. So this is the way of protecting our APIs with JWT token. So let me do a quick recap here. First, we need to configure the JWT module for creating the JWT. Then in the login API, upon a successful login, we're going to create a token with the login function of the auth service. It calls the JWT service.sign function and pass the payload object, which actually contains the ID of the user. It creates a token, and then we're going to return back the token as a response for this login API. And then we need to create a JWT strategy, and the JWT strategy is not for creating the JWT token. It's for protecting our APIs with the JWT. So it will actually examine the headers of the incoming request and extract the JWT token from the header of the request, decode that with this secret key, which is the same secret key that we have used to create the JWT. And then if it was successful, it will call the validate function with the decoded payload. And then we can just extract the ID of the user from the payload.sap. This object will be appended to the request object under the name user, just as the local strategy. Then we have created a JWT Auth guard, and inside the user controller, we have protected this guard with the use guards and passed the JWT Auth guard. So again, each request to this API first go through the guards here, and the JWT guards is activated, extract the JWT from the request, validate that, and append the decoded object under the name user to the request object. Then we can extract the user ID from the request object, and then we can get the profile based on the user ID that we have extracted from the JWT. And if the JWT is not present in the headers of the request, or the JWT is expired, or it's not a valid JWT, the JWT Auth guard will immediately throw an unauthorized exception. Actually, the user can't access to this endpoint in the first place. So that's it, the way that we protect our API with JWT. Okay, that's it for this episode of our NestJS full course. In the next episode, we are going to implement the refresh token functionality. And then in the next section, we are going to see how we can revoke the JWTs in our NestJS project. So if this video was helpful for you, please hit the like button and helps me to grow faster on YouTube. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please support me by subscribing to my channel and hit the notification bell in order to get informed about the next video. So have a nice time. Stay tuned for my next video. Bye bye.